It was 10 years ago when I started working in a call center as part of the IT department. Most of the employees worked in sales, management, or other customer service roles, but our department was the only one that provided technical support for customers. It felt a little strange being the only woman in my department, but I wanted to prove I could handle the job just as well as anyone else. After my training, I was given two choices for my shift. I could either work from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. 5 days a week, or work the later shift from 2 p.m. to midnight for 4 days a week. I decided on the second option. The idea of working 10 hours a day for 4 days in exchange for 3 days off seemed like a good deal to me. What I didn't consider was that after 6 p.m., I'd be the only person left in the building. That thought made me a little uneasy, but the doors were always locked after everyone else left, so I figured I'd be safe. Most of our customers used our internet services during regular business hours, so by 8 o'clock or 9 p.m., the phone calls would slow down a lot. Sometimes I'd only get 2 or 3 calls between 8 p.m. and midnight. To pass the time, I usually brought something to keep me busy when the phone wasn't ringing. Occasionally, I'd go down to the basement to grab a snack or drink from the vending machines. The basement was a bit creepy, mostly because there were windows that faced the back of the building, which was surrounded by nothing but dense forest. Something about that view always made me uneasy, but I'd still head down there whenever I needed something. One night, after a long day, I was feeling really tired and was struggling to stay awake at my desk. I decided to go down to the basement to grab a soda from the vending machine, hoping the caffeine would help me power through the last few hours of my shift. As I walked past the basement windows, I thought I saw something move outside, but I brushed it off. It wasn't unusual to see animals like deer out there, since the forest was so close to the building. I grabbed my soda from the vending machine when suddenly I heard a loud bang, like something had hit one of the windows. The sound startled me so much that I froze for a moment, then quickly grabbed my drink and hurried back upstairs. Once I got back to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was probably just an animal outside, but I couldn't help glancing at the windows around my desk, seeing nothing but darkness. Just when I thought I was getting over it, I heard a noise coming from the front door area. I looked over and saw a tall man standing there, cupping his hands around his face, trying to see inside. My heart skipped a beat as I quickly ducked down behind my desk, but just before I disappeared from view, he spotted me. Our eyes locked for a split second, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I could hear the man trying to open the front door, but thankfully, it was locked. Then he started banging on it, harder and harder. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, trying to stay as calm as I could, but my voice was trembling. As I was still on the phone, there was a loud crash. It sounded like something had shattered. I crouched down behind my desk, my heart racing. I kept talking to the dispatcher, describing what I was hearing, and they reassured me that the police were on their way. But in a situation like that, every second felt like an eternity. The sound of the man banging on the door continued, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was going to get inside before the police arrived. After what felt like forever, the dispatcher asked me to take a look at the front door. I was terrified to even peek, but I knew I needed to. I slowly stood up and looked over at the door. A large part of the glass at the top had been shattered, but it didn't look like the man could fit through the opening. Still, it was unsettling to see the damage. Then, finally, I heard the sweet sound of sirens in the distance. The flashing lights outside were a welcome sight. The police arrived, and I thanked the dispatcher before hanging up the phone. I unlocked the door and spoke to the officers, explaining what had happened. Unfortunately, the man had already run off by the time they got there. The police suspected that he heard the sirens and bolted into the woods to escape. We called the business owner, and it was decided that the building would close for the night. I couldn't shake the feeling of fear, even after the police left. My coworkers speculated about who the man was and what he wanted, but we never found out for sure. All we knew was that he seemed determined to get inside, and that thought alone kept me on edge. After that night, I couldn't work the late shift without constantly looking over my shoulder. The basement trips became even scarier, and every little noise made me jump. I eventually asked to switch to the earlier shift, and luckily I was able to. Looking back, I'm glad I trusted my instincts and took action when I did. I'll never forget that night, and I'll always be grateful that I was able to call for help before things got worse. Even though it's been years since that incident, the memory still lingers. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life, and I hope I never have to go through something like that again. I work at a clothing shop in a big mall, and recently I got promoted to assistant manager. After a few weeks of training, I had to close the store by myself for the first time. We didn't have many employees, so it was just me and one other worker that evening. I was a little nervous, but I figured it would be fine since nothing much ever happened at the store during the late hours. As I was working near the front of the store, organizing some clothes, I noticed a man sitting on a bench just outside. He was talking on his phone, but it didn't seem like a big deal. I smiled at him as I was doing my job, thinking nothing of it. There were always people sitting outside the store, waiting for friends or just relaxing, so I didn't pay him much attention. A little later, I asked my coworker to help me put up a new signboard. It was a big one that we had to hang from the ceiling, so it took us a bit of time to get it just right. After that, I went back to the front of the store to check if everything was in order. When I looked outside, I noticed that the same man was still sitting on the bench. This time, though, he wasn't on the phone. He glanced at me and then started whispering to himself, but I could still hear bits of what he was saying. I might be able to take two. Here comes one now, I heard him mutter under his breath. That made me feel uneasy. I started thinking that maybe he was planning to steal something. We'd had some issues lately with people grabbing items from the front tables and running off with them. So I moved closer to the front of the store and started folding clothes, keeping an eye on him. I figured if I stayed nearby, he might think twice about doing anything suspicious. A few minutes later, the man looked right at me and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, can you come here for a moment?" I politely told him that I couldn't because I was the manager on duty and needed to stay in the store. I didn't want to leave the store unattended, especially with only one other person working that evening. But he kept asking, saying things like he just needed a quick favor. Each time I said no. Then he changed his tone a bit and said, "I just want to show you how nice that banner looks, the one you put up." That's when things started to feel really weird. Something in the way he was acting made me uncomfortable. So I took a few steps back into the store, putting some distance between us. I didn't want to go outside, and now I wasn't sure if he was planning something or just being creepy. To my surprise, the man got up from the bench and walked into the store after me. He started looking around, talking the whole time, though his words didn't really make much sense. I was just about to tell my coworker to call security when, thankfully, my boss came in. She was there to put up the schedule for next week. My boss is older, bigger, and more intimidating than I am. When the man saw her walk in and realized she worked there too, he quickly left the store. He didn't say a word, just turned around and walked out in a hurry. I felt a huge sense of relief. I immediately went to my boss and told her what had happened. She looked really concerned. We had been hearing about strange incidents in the mall lately, but nothing like this had happened to me before. Just as we were talking, a security guard walked by, so I stopped him and explained the situation. The guard listened carefully and told me they had heard about similar things happening in the mall recently, with a few people complaining about strange men trying to lure them outside or following them around. As we were talking, I glanced toward the mall entrance and saw the same man again, walking further down the corridor. "There he is," I said, pointing him out to the guard. The security guard nodded and walked over to talk to the man. I watched from inside the store, nervous about what might happen next. After a few minutes, the guard came back and told us that he had warned the man not to bother anyone else. But since the man hadn't done anything illegal, they couldn't call the police. There just wasn't enough reason. Even though the situation didn't escalate, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had. The whole thing felt too close for comfort. Luckily, I haven't seen the man since that day. The security team has been keeping an eye out for any suspicious people, and I've been more careful when I work closing shifts. I make sure to always have someone with me, and I keep my phone handy in case anything strange happens again. Working at the clothing store is usually a fun and easy job, but that night reminded me that things can change in an instant. You always have to be aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts. Looking back, I'm just glad I didn't leave the store when that man first asked me to come outside. Who knows what could have happened if I had? It was winter of 2017 when I had one of the scariest experiences of my life. At the time, I was working at a gas station in a small town. I used to start my shifts very early in the morning. Just a few days before I started that job, I had crashed my car into the side of the road during an ice storm. Since my car was totaled and I had to wait for the insurance money to get a new one, I didn't have any way to drive to work. Luckily, the gas station was only about a mile and a half from my apartment. I figured it wouldn't be a big deal to walk to work until I could afford a new car. It wasn't too far, and I told myself it could be a good way to get some exercise. So that's what I did. Every morning, I would wake up early and start walking down the quiet road toward work. Most of the time, the road was pretty smooth, and there were usually a few cars driving by, but at 4:30 in the morning, it was pitch dark, and seeing another car was rare. One very cold morning, I started my usual walk to work. Everything seemed normal at first. I bundled up in my warmest clothes, put on my gloves, and grabbed my flashlight, since it was far too dark to walk without it. The road passed through a wooded area about halfway between my apartment and the gas station. That part of the walk always made me a bit uneasy because it was so dark, and there were no streetlights to make me feel safe. As I entered the wooded stretch of road, I clicked on my flashlight and started scanning the area around me, just to be sure I wasn't going to trip over anything. The beam of light cut through the darkness, bouncing off trees and bushes as I walked. I wasn't too worried at first. I had passed through this area many times before. It was always quiet, and I had never seen anyone else out there at that hour. But then I heard something. It was a rustling sound coming from the bushes ahead of me. I stopped in my tracks, feeling my heart race a little. It sounded like something or someone was moving in the bushes. I shined my light in the direction of the noise, trying to see what it was. For a moment, I held my breath, feeling a wave of fear rush over me. Then, a deer jumped out of the bushes, ran across the road, and disappeared into the shrubs on the other side. I let out a nervous laugh. I told myself not to be so scared. This was a small town, and nothing around here could hurt me. I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone or something was watching me. It didn't help that the woods were so dark and quiet, with no cars or streetlights in sight. A little further down the road, that creepy feeling came back. This time it was stronger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just another deer, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I shone my flashlight toward the trees on my left, scanning the area carefully. About 50 feet behind me, I saw something. At first, it looked like someone crouching down, facing a bush with their back to me. My first thought was that it might be a homeless person, but when I stopped and focused the light on them, I realized, to my horror, that this wasn't a person at all. It was something else, something I had never seen before. Its body was pale with no hair, and it didn't look like it was wearing any clothes. Its limbs were long and thin, almost unnatural. If it stood up, I guessed it would be taller than 8 feet. Its arms and legs were so long and skinny, and at the ends of its fingers, I could see sharp black points, like claws. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As soon as I shined my light directly on it, it turned its head to look at me. Its eyes glowed in the dark, just like an animal's eyes do when light hits them. It reminded me of a cat's or a deer's eyes, but this thing was definitely not an animal. I didn't get a clear look at its face, but from what I could see, it was no human. Panic took over, and without thinking, I turned and ran as fast as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely catch my breath. I didn't stop to look back, not even once. I was too terrified to know if it was following me, but I thought I could hear it behind me, chasing me. I kept running down the road, praying that I would make it to safety. In the distance, I saw car headlights coming toward me, and for a moment I felt a small sense of relief. The car passed by, its taillights disappearing behind me, but the fear didn't leave me. I couldn't hear the creature anymore, but I didn't dare slow down. I ran all the way to the gas station, not stopping until I was safely inside. When I finally burst through the door, I was gasping for air and my hands were shaking. My coworker was already there, getting ready for his shift. He looked at me with concern, asking what had happened. I told him everything about the strange creature I had seen in the woods, the way it looked, and how it had chased me. To my surprise, he didn't look as shocked as I thought he would. Instead, he seemed worried. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that another one of our coworkers had seen the exact same thing just a few weeks before. They had described it in the same way: pale skin, long limbs, glowing eyes, and sharp claws. Hearing that someone else had seen it too only made me more terrified. I made up my mind right then and there. I was never going to walk to work in the dark again. From that point on, I called an Uber or got a ride from a friend whenever I had an early shift. I didn't care how much it cost. I wasn't going to risk running into that thing again. To this day, I still don't know what it was that I saw. Part of me wants to believe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down, I know it was real. And even though I've moved to a different town and no longer work at that gas station, I'll never forget that cold, dark morning in the winter of 2017. A few years ago, my family decided to take a road trip to California. It was me, my parents, and my younger brother. We were excited for the long drive, but the trip took an unexpected turn when we had to pass through Iowa. As the day turned to night, we started to feel tired, and our phones weren't working very well. The signal was weak, and none of us had service. It was close to midnight when we realized we needed a place to rest. After driving for hours, everyone was exhausted, and we needed a hotel or motel to crash for the night. My dad took the next exit off the highway. We seemed to be in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by cornfields and trees. The road was empty, and we hadn't seen another car for quite some time. It felt eerie, like we were far away from civilization. After driving for what seemed like forever, we finally saw a small town up ahead, about a mile or two from the highway. It wasn't much, just a gas station, a couple of restaurants, and a small motel. The motel had a big old sign out front, advertising rooms for only $20 a night. It didn't look like the nicest place, but at that point we didn't care. We were all tired, and the price was cheap, so we decided to stay there for the night. The motel was a single-story building with about 10 rooms total. My dad parked the car in front of our room, and he went into the lobby to get the key. When he came back, we grabbed our bags and went inside. The room was simple and small, but it had everything we needed: 2 beds, a bathroom, and a TV. I was just relieved to have a place to lie down after such a long day on the road. I turned on the TV, but it was an old box-style television, the kind that you hardly see anymore. It only had 8 channels, none of which were interesting. I asked my dad for the Wi-Fi code so I could check my phone, but he said the motel didn't have Wi-Fi. I was a bit disappointed, especially since my phone hadn't had service for hours, but I reminded myself that it was just $20 a night. I decided I could go without the internet for one night and get some sleep instead. We all fell asleep pretty fast. The day had been long, and the quiet of the town made it easy to drift off. However, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise outside our room. It wasn't very loud at first, so I just sat up in bed and listened. The noise stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then I heard it again. This time, it was the sound of the doorknob jiggling, like someone was trying to open the door. I glanced at my parents and brother, but they were all still asleep. Part of me wanted to wake them up, but I was curious to see what was happening. Maybe it was nothing, just someone who got the wrong room. Still, something didn't feel right. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed to the window. My heart was pounding as I carefully pulled back the blinds, just enough to peek outside. What I saw made me jump back in fear. There, right outside the window, was a man. He looked strange, almost creepy, with messy hair and worn-out clothes. He didn't seem to notice me looking at him. but he was standing right in front of our door. My hands were shaking, and I didn't know what to do. The man didn't leave, though. He walked up to the door again and started jiggling the knob, trying to open it. This time, I couldn't stay quiet. I rushed to wake my dad. As I shook him awake, the man began banging on the door, loud, heavy bangs that filled the quiet night. My dad jumped out of bed, half awake, and headed straight for the door. The banging was so loud that by now my mom and brother were awake too. My dad yelled through the door, telling the man to leave us alone. For a few seconds, the banging stopped, and there was silence. We all stood there, holding our breath. But just as we thought it was over, the banging started again, even louder than before. My heart was racing, and I felt like we were trapped. My brother looked scared, and my mom stood close to us, unsure of what to do. My dad shouted again, telling the man to leave, but he didn't listen. After what felt like forever, the banging suddenly stopped. We heard the man's footsteps as he walked away, and the night went silent again. None of us dared to move for a while, afraid that the man might come back. My dad checked the door, making sure it was locked, and we all sat together in the room, too scared to go back to sleep. We thought about leaving right then and there, but it was the middle of the night, and we didn't want to drive in the dark, especially with no phone service. So we decided to stay until sunrise, even though no one felt safe anymore. We sat awake in the room, jumping at every little sound we heard outside. Eventually, dawn came, and with it a small sense of relief. At around 7 a.m., my dad went to the front desk to tell the motel staff what had happened. He hoped they'd take it seriously, but they barely seemed to care. It was as if this kind of thing happened all the time. My dad was frustrated, but there wasn't much we could do. We packed up our things, left the motel, and hit the road again. It took about an hour of driving before we got phone service back, and it was such a relief to finally be able to use our phones. The rest of the trip to California was uneventful, and we actually had a great time once we got there. But I'll always remember that terrifying night in the small motel, stuck in the middle of nowhere, with a strange man trying to get into our room. It's one of those memories that never really leaves you, no matter how much time passes. Not many believe this, but I assure you, every word is genuine. This unsettling experience unfolded on the dark web about 7 or 8 years ago, marking my first exploration of the eerie digital realm. Intrigued by the mysterious and often illicit activities rumored to lurk there, my friend John was the one who initially piqued my interest in the dark web. John, in his enthusiastic narrative, painted a vivid picture of the dark web's underworld, everything from hitmen for hire to hackers who could breach almost any digital fortress. Amidst these chilling accounts, he spoke of a sinister site showcasing videos of violence and assault, an unsettling aspect that, fortunately, I never personally encountered. My curiosity led me to explore a site peddling illegal drugs and weapons, where transactions were conducted through the cryptocurrency Bitcoin. The website's inventory ranged from small knives to outright rocket launchers, a realm far removed from my own interests. While perusing, an unexpected incident froze my computer. Initially dismissing it as a coincidence, I rebooted my PC only to receive a menacing pop-up instructing me to leave the site as I was not welcome. The situation escalated when my address appeared on the screen, plunging me into a moment of paralyzed fear. Hastily, I powered down my computer and took deep breaths, vowing never to venture into the dark web again. However, this vow couldn't shield me from the impending events that unfolded about a week later. As I stepped outside one day to check the mail, a peculiar sensation gripped me. At the end of my driveway, I noticed someone observing me from a distance. Despite the daylight, the encounter felt eerie, especially considering the seclusion of the dirt road I lived on. Offering a cautious smile and wave, I retreated indoors, only to discover an unnerving package in my mail. Opening it revealed a collection of photos documenting various aspects of my life, some captured within the confines of my home, others taken during mundane activities. The invasion of privacy was staggering, reaching unsettling extents like snapshots in the bathroom. Realizing I was being stalked, panic set in, prompting me to confide in friends. Despite their advice to involve the police, I hesitated. Instead, I opted to fortify my home with surveillance cameras, hoping to catch the perpetrator red-handed. The night soon brought a jarring realization as the sound of shattering glass propelled me from my recliner. Racing to the living room window, my friend and I discovered the aftermath of a break-in, but the intruder remained elusive. With no other recourse, we called the police, only to face the harsh reality that the mysterious assailant had vanished. Describing the man from the mailbox incident offered scant leads. Clad in a black morph suit or costume, his identity remained a mystery. Faced with the undeniable threat, I sought refuge elsewhere until I could secure a new, more affordable dwelling. This unsettling episode underscored the perilous nature of the dark web, reinforcing my commitment to steer clear of its shadowy depths. The brush with danger left an indelible mark, shattering any illusions I might have harbored about the web's darker corners. In the summer of 2015, my boyfriend Sean and I decided to take a trip to Vermont. We were excited to escape the hustle and bustle of our daily lives and enjoy some time in nature. I found a charming Airbnb listing for an off-grid cabin. It had hundreds of 5-star reviews, so I felt confident it would be a great place to stay. The cabin was an old one-room structure with a potbelly stove and a loft area for sleeping. There was no electricity, and it was located in a remote part of Vermont, down an old dirt road. The nearest house, owned by our host, was about half a mile away, but she was out of town, so we had the place to ourselves. We arrived around 4 p.m. and spent a lovely evening cooking dinner and playing board games by candlelight. We had hiked all day, so by 10 p.m. we were exhausted. I went up to the loft to sleep while Sean decided to sit outside and smoke. About 20 minutes later, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I was jolted awake by a loud banging sound on the side of the cabin. Before I could call out, Sean shouted up to me, asking if it was me making the noise. I groggily replied, "No, was that you?" He said no, but didn't seem too worried since he was sitting outside and hadn't seen anyone. We camp often, so we're used to strange noises at night. We figured it was probably a tree branch falling against the cabin and tried to go back to sleep. But just as I started to drift off again, there was another loud bang, this time from a different part of the cabin. I jumped out of bed and climbed down from the loft, meeting Sean as he came through the door. He told me to grab anything sharp I could find and go back into the loft. Although he was trying to stay calm, I could tell he was a little freaked out. I asked him what he thought it was, but he cautiously said he didn't know. He mentioned that he might have heard footsteps while he was outside. As we whispered about what to do, we heard a slow scraping noise trailing along the wall of the cabin. Then, silence again. I was really scared and didn't know what to do. Our car was parked about 100 feet away, but we'd have to face whatever was out there in the dark to get to it. I was also worried that if it was a person, they might have tampered with the car. Sean told me to stay very quiet and go back up to the loft while he waited downstairs. He had a hunting knife and a large stick, while I had a few steak knives. We were basically sitting ducks. The cabin had large windows on 3 walls, half of which were just screens, so if someone was outside, they could easily see us or get inside. I wanted to stay downstairs, but Sean insisted I go upstairs, saying it would be easier for him to handle things without worrying about me. I reluctantly went up and sat in the middle of the bed, clutching the knives. I listened intently, my heart pounding in my chest. Sean shouted out, "Hello?" to see if he could get a response or scare off any animals. There was nothing for what felt like 20 minutes. Then the scraping sound returned, louder this time, like someone dragging a rake across the side of the cabin. I heard clear, methodical footsteps moving around the cabin. Sean came up to the loft and pulled the ladder up. He didn't like that they could see him, but he couldn't see them. If someone came in, at least we could get the jump on them from up here. We sat on the bed in silence, staring at each other in terror. It was around midnight, and I realized we were going to be stuck in that cabin until morning. The noises continued and intensified. There were more bangs from different sides of the cabin, and the scraping kept coming back. This couldn't have been an animal. The sounds were too deliberate. We didn't hear any grunting like from a bear or bobcat, just the constant crunch of footsteps. There were pauses of 10 to 20 minutes, then the noises would start up again. At one point, we heard a rattling sound like someone was trying to climb the pipe that fed into the potbelly stove. This went on for hours. Sean and I lay there, paralyzed with fear, staring at each other. I kept expecting the front door to burst open or the screen window to tear. I was convinced we were about to be murdered. Every gruesome possibility played in my head, but no one ever came inside. We never heard voices, whispers, or deranged giggling, just the loud scraping, banging, rattling, and footsteps. Finally, around 5 a.m., we heard roosters in the distance, and the loft was slowly lit by the early dawn light. The sound stopped. I managed to get about 2 hours of sleep because we had to drive to Pennsylvania later that day. Thankfully, our car was fine, and we packed up as quickly as possible to get out of there. Sean looked around the cabin, trying to find scraping marks or clear footprints, but there was nothing. I messaged the Airbnb host to tell her about our experience, and she said it must have been a porcupine. If you find a porcupine that makes loud banging noises and walks like a human, let me know. To this day, Sean and I debate what it could have been. He thinks it was a crazy local trying to scare us away. Either way, I'm just glad we weren't murdered that night. I'm a 36-year-old guy living in a cozy ground floor apartment in a quiet town in England with my girlfriend. This whole thing happened on a Saturday night when I found myself home alone while my girlfriend went out with a couple of friends she hadn't seen in ages. Now, I'm a bit of a night owl, especially on weekends, so I figured I'd stay up late just in case they needed a ride home instead of getting a taxi. My plan was to catch up on some YouTube videos and maybe indulge in a little laptop gaming. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I heard the unmistakable sound of my front door handle rattling. I paused the TV, my heart skipping a beat as I listened. Sure enough, I heard it again. Someone was messing with my door handle, and they were doing it fast. Confusion washed over me because my girlfriend wasn't due back until closer to midnight, and she definitely wouldn't be trying to break into her own place. I cautiously made my way to the door, peering out through the peephole. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man standing a short distance away, facing away from me with his head in his hands. Alarm bells started ringing in my head, and I immediately got a gut feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to play it safe and pretend I wasn't home, figuring it was just some drunken fool who stumbled upon the wrong door. I turned the TV back on but kept the volume low, my senses on high alert. About half an hour passed, and I heard the same rattling noise again. My nerves were shot, and I sprang into action, heading straight for the door. This time, I decided to confront whoever it was and demand answers. I swung the door open, ready to give the intruder a piece of my mind. To my surprise, the guy looked just as bewildered as I felt. Without missing a beat, I told him straight up that I saw him trying to open my door earlier, and if he didn't leave right then, I'd be calling the cops. He seemed taken aback, his tired eyes meeting mine, and without a word, he backed away and retreated to the entryway of our apartment block, where he sat with his head in his hands. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, but I didn't want to overreact either. I shot a quick text to my girlfriend, filling her in on the situation and urging her to give me a call when she was ready to come home. I didn't want her risking running into this guy if she decided to grab a taxi. As I waited for her call, I turned off the TV and kept myself occupied with my phone. Sure enough, just after midnight, she rang to say she was ready to head back. When I went to meet her, the entryway was empty, and there was no sign of the guy anywhere. I kept my eyes peeled as we made our way to the car, just in case. When we got home, my girlfriend brushed off the whole thing, chalking it up to some drunk guy trying to find his way home. I nodded along, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The guy seemed more tired than drunk to me, but I guess appearances can be deceiving. I have no clue if he knew someone in our apartment block, or if he had more sinister intentions. All I know is that I'm relieved we always keep our front door locked and bolted, because if it had been unlocked that night, who knows what could have happened. All I can do now is hope he never comes back and pray that we stay safe and sound in our little home. In the summer of 2015, my boyfriend Sean and I decided to take a trip to Vermont. The cabin was an old one-room structure with a potbelly stove and a loft area for sleeping. There was no electricity, and it was located in a remote part of Vermont, down an old dirt road. The nearest house, owned by our host, was about half a mile away, but she was out of town, so we had the place to ourselves. We arrived around 4 p.m. and spent a lovely evening cooking dinner and playing board games by candlelight. We had hiked all day, so by 10 p.m. we were exhausted. I went up to the loft to sleep while Sean decided to sit outside and smoke. About 20 minutes later, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I was jolted awake by a loud banging sound on the side of the cabin. Before I could call out, Sean shouted up to me, asking if it was me making the noise. I groggily replied, "No, was that you?" He said no, but didn't seem too worried since he was sitting outside and hadn't seen anyone. We camp often, so we're used to strange noises at night. We figured it was probably a tree branch falling against the cabin and tried to go back to sleep. But just as I started to drift off again, there was another loud bang, this time from a different part of the cabin. I jumped out of bed and climbed down from the loft, meeting Sean as he came through the door. He told me to grab anything sharp I could find and go back into the loft. Although he was trying to stay calm, I could tell he was a little freaked out. I asked him what he thought it was, but he cautiously said he didn't know. He mentioned that he might have heard footsteps while he was outside. As we whispered about what to do, we heard a slow, scraping noise trailing along the wall of the cabin. Then silence again. I was really scared and didn't know what to do. Our car was parked about 100 feet away, but we'd have to face whatever was out there in the dark to get to it. I was also worried that if it was a person, they might have tampered with the car. Sean told me to stay very quiet and go back up to the loft while he waited downstairs. He had a hunting knife and a large stick, while I had a few steak knives. We were basically sitting ducks. The cabin had large windows on 3 walls, half of which were just screens, so if someone was outside, they could easily see us or get inside. I wanted to stay downstairs, but Sean insisted I go upstairs, saying it would be easier for him to handle things without worrying about me. I reluctantly went up and sat in the middle of the bed, clutching the knives. I listened intently, my heart pounding in my chest. Sean shouted out, "Hello?" to see if he could get a response or scare off any animals. There was nothing for what felt like 20 minutes. Then the scraping sound returned, louder this time, like someone dragging a rake across the side of the cabin. I heard clear, methodical footsteps moving around the cabin. Sean came up to the loft and pulled the ladder up. He didn't like that they could see him, but he couldn't see them. If someone came in, at least we could get the jump on them from up here. We sat on the bed in silence, staring at each other in terror. It was around midnight, and I realized we were going to be stuck in that cabin until morning. The noises continued and intensified. There were more bangs from different sides of the cabin, and the scraping kept coming back. This couldn't have been an animal. The sounds were too deliberate. We didn't hear any grunting like from a bear or bobcat, just the constant crunch of footsteps. There were pauses of 10 to 20 minutes, then the noises would start up again. At one point, we heard a rattling sound like someone was trying to climb the pipe that fed into the potbelly stove. This went on for hours. Sean and I lay there, paralyzed with fear, staring at each other. I kept expecting the front door to burst open or the screen window to tear. I was convinced we were about to be murdered. Every gruesome possibility played in my head, but no one ever came inside. We never heard voices, whispers, or deranged giggling, just the loud scraping, banging, rattling, and footsteps. Finally, around 5 a.m., we heard roosters in the distance, and the loft was slowly lit by the early dawn light. The sound stopped. I managed to get about 2 hours of sleep because we had to drive to Pennsylvania later that day. Thankfully, our car was fine, and we packed up as quickly as possible to get out of there. Sean looked around the cabin, trying to find scraping marks or clear footprints, but there was nothing. I messaged the Airbnb host to tell her about our experience, and she said it must have been a porcupine. If you find a porcupine that makes loud banging noises and walks like a human, let me know. To this day, Sean and I debate what it could have been. He thinks it was a crazy local trying to scare us away. Either way, I'm just glad we weren't murdered that night. In 2006, my family and I moved into this old house. It was at least 90 years old, but surprisingly in pretty good condition considering its age. My parents chose the house because it was close to the middle school I'd be attending, and it made it convenient for both of them to get to work on time. Most days, I'd come home from school to an empty house since my parents would still be at work. Occasionally, one of them would leave early and come home, but that was rare. Now, some might say that 11 is too young to be left home alone, but I considered myself mature and responsible enough to handle it. Plus, being home alone meant I could have some much-needed me time. Whether it was doing homework, playing video games, or just tidying up the house, there was always something to keep me occupied. One day, my parents informed me that they wouldn't be back until much later. Mom was going out with some friends, and Dad was working overtime. I didn't mind, though. I assured them that I'd be fine and went about my evening as usual. Little did I know, things were about to take a terrifying turn. As I lounged around the house, enjoying the quiet solitude, a thunderstorm rolled in, adding an extra layer of spookiness to the atmosphere. Mom left around 5 p.m., leaving me with the entire house to myself. I spent the next hour studying for a science test and playing some video games on our beloved Wii console. Ah, those were the days. Mid-game, my stomach started rumbling, signaling that it was snack time. I paused my game and headed downstairs to raid the pantry. But as I descended the stairs, I noticed something peculiar. The hallway light leading to the kitchen was on. Now that was strange because my parents were sticklers for conserving electricity and never left lights on unnecessarily. Ignoring the oddity, I continued into the kitchen, only to freeze in my tracks at the sight before me. There was a man crouched down by our food pantry. Clutching a hammer, he must have pilfered from Dad's toolbox. My heart pounded in my chest as I silently backed away and retreated upstairs. Once safely back in my room, I grabbed the phone and dialed the police, my voice barely above a whisper as I explained the situation. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but warned that it might take a while due to the storm. With trembling hands, I crawled into my closet, praying that the intruder wouldn't find me. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slow, each second feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps echoing up the stairs, sending shivers down my spine. I held my breath, my heart racing as the footsteps drew nearer. When they stopped outside my door, my blood ran cold. The man began tapping lightly on my door, his voice oozing with malice as he demanded entry. Panic surged through me, and I screamed out a resounding no as tears welled up in my eyes. But the pounding continued, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the piercing wail of police sirens cut through the night. The intruder hesitated for a moment before redoubling his efforts, but it was no use. The police burst through the door, tackling him to the ground and ending the nightmare. As I emerged from my hiding spot, I was enveloped in the comforting embrace of a female police officer. She reassured me that everything was going to be okay and gently asked if I knew the man. I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper as I recounted the terrifying ordeal. It turned out that the guy had entered our house through an unlocked door and made himself at home in our kitchen. The police hauled him away, but the memory of his bloodshot eyes and menacing grin haunted me long after he was gone. From that day on, my parents never left me home alone until I turned 15. Even now, as an adult, I still have fears of being alone and always remind my fiancé to lock the doors when he leaves for work. Some childhood fears never truly go away, but I'm determined to ensure that my own children never experience the same terror I did. It was another late night at my workplace, and I found myself immersed in the task of completing a report with a looming deadline. To keep myself alert, I had a cup of tea by my side, attempting to finish the work as swiftly as possible. Working late had become a regular part of my routine, but maintaining focus became increasingly challenging as exhaustion set in. Around 11 p.m., a knock echoed through the quiet office. Puzzled, I stood up and glanced down the hallway. It seemed odd for someone to be at my door at this hour. Walking to the other end of the house, I peered through the peephole, but there was no one on my porch. I stepped back, thinking that maybe I misidentified the source of the sound, engrossed as I was in my work. With the knock momentarily dismissed, I returned to my office engrossed in typing away on my computer. After a while, the knocking had not repeated, and I was gradually succumbing to fatigue. However, just as I was considering calling it a night, I reached for my tea, and there, in the window across the room, a pair of eyes stared back at me. At first, all I could discern was that it was a man. Startled, he swiftly retreated from the window. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat there, fixated on the window. It was an unexpected intrusion, and I found myself in a daze. After a moment, I rose and rushed to cover the window. I didn't know who he was or why he was peering into my house, but the late hour intensified the fear. Leaving my office, I went to the front of the house to check the peephole again. But there was no sign of him in the front yard. I then moved to a back window, scanning the surroundings, but once more there was no one to be seen. Despite the adrenaline surging through me, the sudden silence in the house began to unsettle me. Had the man left, or was he still lurking outside? Returning to my office, I grabbed my phone, intending to call the police while keeping an eye on the doors and windows. However, as I reached the end of the hallway, a sizable figure loomed in the back of the living room. He was tall, clad in thick clothing to conceal his identity, yet his eyes differed from those I had seen in the window. This was someone else. Without hesitation, the man charged across the room toward me. Panicking, I sprinted for my office, locking the door behind me and bracing myself for an attempted breach. To my surprise, the intruder slowed down and stopped just outside the door. I could hear his heavy breathing and pacing in the hallway. Suddenly, another light knocking sound echoed from the opposite side of the house. The man outside my office started walking back down the hallway toward the living room. Then an eerie silence fell over the house. I stayed pressed against the door, unsure of what would happen next. It was during this tense moment that I decided to call the police, whispering urgently into my phone, pleading for a swift response. After what felt like an agonizing wait, I heard the approaching sirens. The police entered my house without any confrontations, searching through each room, including mine. Strangely, they never encountered either of the intruders. To this day, I remain puzzled about how the first man gained entry and what their intentions were. The memory of the knocking lingers, leaving me to wonder if it was their form of communication, both inside and outside the house. However, the initial knock I heard still perplexes me. Recalling that night sends shivers down my spine, contemplating how long one man had been observing me and how long the other had been inside my home. While I acknowledge my fortunate escape, the fear of a potential return haunts my thoughts. Relying on luck for my safety is not a comforting prospect, and the uncertainty of their motives keeps me on edge. It was just a few months back when I moved into this tiny one-story house conveniently close to my workplace. Previously, I had to endure a nearly hour-long drive every day, so this relocation felt like a breath of fresh air. However, I hadn't explored much beyond my workplace in this new area, making it feel like an entirely different place. On this particular night, I finished work at 6 o'clock and headed straight home. With another workday ahead, my plan was to unwind, grab a bite, and hit the bed early. Pulling into my garage, I entered the house and decided to heat up some leftover pizza. As the oven did its work, a sudden ring of the doorbell startled me. It was strange because I hadn't heard it before, and I had no clue who could be at my door. Curiosity led me to the front door, where I found a woman, perhaps around 50 years old, with long gray hair. I greeted her, and she smiled warmly, mentioning that she noticed my recent move. Our conversation delved into mundane small talk, covering topics like where I came from, whether I had a wife or kids, and other casual inquiries. She bid me good night and walked away. I never got the chance to ask her name, but something about the encounter felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Perhaps it was just because she seemed a bit peculiar. Returning to the kitchen with my pizza, I settled on the couch to find an interesting YouTube video. Opting for a random commentary video to serve as background noise while I ate, I only enjoyed about 10 minutes before a noise outside caught my attention. Pausing the TV, I discerned the sound of an idling car engine, surprisingly loud. Peering out the front window, I noticed a car parked right in front of my house. Oddly, all the headlights were off, and despite ample space on the street, they chose to park in front of my house. Observing the car for a few minutes yielded no changes, so I returned to the couch. However, a whole half hour passed with the persistent hum of the car's engine. Abruptly, it shut off. I paused the TV once more, straining to hear any other sound. After a minute of silence, I rose and approached the window, confirming that the car was stationary, engine off, and no one else in sight. Closing the blinds, just in case, I went back to the couch to tidy up. As I cleaned, a quiet thump emanated from the other side of the house, setting me on edge. Nervously, I walked over to the hallway and glanced towards the kitchen. In a split second, I caught the shadow of someone walking away from the back door, as if they had noticed me and were attempting to conceal their presence. Reacting quickly, I circled the house towards the front and, peering out the window, saw a man getting into the parked car, which then sped away. My first instinct was to check the back door. Opening it, I noticed the handle on the outside was unusually loose, as if someone had tampered with it. Pulling the flimsy handle slightly to the side, I could see the inner workings of the lock, realizing that the man was dangerously close to gaining entry. While I can't say for sure if the old lady from earlier was involved, it struck me as odd. Her questions focused on whether anyone else lived with me, raising the possibility that she might have been gathering information to assess if I was a suitable target for their plans. Since that incident, a few months have passed, and I've never crossed paths with the old lady or the man again. The memory lingers, leaving me wary and questioning the intentions behind that peculiar encounter. July 25th, 2018, marked a pivotal moment in my life. At that time, I had recently delved into the world of ride-sharing, juggling both Uber and Lyft as a side hustle to supplement my income. The pay wasn't stellar, but the flexibility was unparalleled, freeing me from the constraints of a traditional job. It was a chilled and steady gig, but it demanded constant vigilance. On that Independence Day, I made the decision to dedicate my evening to Ubering. With the city hosting its annual music festival, drawing thousands of revelers, I knew the demand for rides would be sky high. As anticipated, ride requests flooded in as festival goers spilled out, and I decided to accept one. A man approached my car, confirming if I was his Uber. My affirmative response prompted him to settle into the back seat. The unmistakable scent of marijuana wafted through the car, a byproduct of festival indulgence. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the celebratory atmosphere. Little did I know, the evening was about to take a dark turn. Throughout the ride, the passenger fixated on me, his gaze unwavering, scrutinizing my every move. The discomfort settled in, and I yearned to conclude the ride swiftly. In a brief respite from his intense stare, he retrieved his phone to make a call. As I navigated the streets, the unfamiliar cadence of French filled the car. While I grasped a fair bit of French, courtesy of my aunt, I refrained from eavesdropping on private conversations. However, my ears perked up when he mentioned a girl he was riding with. The blood ran cold in my veins, and I feigned ignorance, hoping he hadn't noticed my comprehension. What followed was a chilling revelation. He outlined his sinister plans, mentioning something about snatching me up after I dropped him off. Panic surged through me. His destination loomed only 5 minutes away. As a petite woman of 5'3", weighing around 150 pounds, I realized the vast physical disadvantage against a towering, muscular man. With urgency pressing upon me, I reached for my phone to call my boyfriend. My plan was to create a ruse, stirring a scene and fabricating an excuse to terminate the ride. Dialing his number, I launched into a fabricated emergency, conjuring images of a bleeding relative on the floor. My boyfriend, utterly perplexed, questioned the surreal scenario unfolding over the phone. Drawing on my past experience in acting school, I played my part convincingly. I abruptly ended the call, turning to the man with a sense of urgency. "Sir, my grandma just hurt herself. I have to go. I'm dropping you off here just a few blocks down." With that, I navigated to a random spot, planning my escape. Before resuming my journey, I dialed my boyfriend once more, revealing the truth and expressing my gratitude for his bewildered cooperation. The ordeal unfolded rapidly, leaving me shaken but unharmed. Later, I reported the incident to Uber, unsure if any investigation ensued. To this day, I remain grateful for my quick thinking, for the French I gleaned from my aunt, and for the unwavering support of my boyfriend. In the labyrinth of the night, their roles became my lifelines, guiding me safely away from a potential peril that loomed on a ride-sharing horizon. So, for the past 3 years, I've been navigating the unpredictable world of delivery driving. It all started at the onset of the pandemic, and let me tell you, it's a lot more taxing than people might assume. Over the years, I've encountered all sorts of customers, but the tale I'm about to share takes the cake. It was a rather unremarkable Thursday, and I found myself immersed in the world of Uber Eats, fulfilling orders for those who preferred the comfort of their homes. My routine usually involved late-night deliveries to keep the cash flowing. During this surge in the popularity of delivery apps, I took advantage of the opportunity and juggled both Uber Eats and DoorDash. On this particular day, I had exclusively chosen Uber Eats for my deliveries. Before long, a sizable order popped up from a house not too far away, a promising prospect for an extra tip. I drove to the designated restaurant, collected the order, and embarked on the 10-minute drive to the customer's address. However, there was a minor inconvenience. A persistent rain had decided to accompany me on my deliveries. I've never been a fan of driving in the rain, but financial realities dictated that I soldier on. It was around 4 in the afternoon when I turned into the road leading to the customer's house. To reach the destination, one had to navigate a narrow pathway cutting through a wooded area, a well-hidden path, unless you deliberately sought it out. I maneuvered my car down this dirt road cautiously, arriving at a modest one-story house where a man sat in a rocking chair, serenely listening to the rain. As I stepped out of my car, he rose to assist me with the food. Initially, he appeared to be a decent, if stereotypical, redneck. He apologized for the confusion in his location, to which I responded with understanding and wished him a pleasant day. As I was about to make my exit, he extended an invitation for me to come inside and try some pastries he had baked earlier. Politely declining, I explained my need to continue with deliveries. Strangely, he seemed unfazed by my refusal, persistently urging me to join him. Even promises of an increased tip failed to sway my decision. Growing visibly annoyed, I maintained composure and firmly declined. Desperate to extricate myself, I resorted to pretending I was on a phone call with another customer, successfully deterring any further insistence. He retreated inside with his food, allowing me to swiftly return to my car and speed away. Now, if the narrative ended there, it would merely be an odd encounter. However, this story takes a dark and unsettling turn. Later that night, my girlfriend and I settled on the couch to catch up on the news. A chilling report caught our attention. A man in the area attempting to lure kids into his truck. Unfortunately, we lived in an area where such incidents weren't unheard of. The shock came when the news report displayed the face of the individual responsible. It was the same man I had delivered food to earlier that day. The same beard, the same hair, there was no doubt. I went absolutely hysterical, nearly spitting out the water I was drinking. Turns out, he was arrested shortly after I completed his delivery. I had sensed something off about him, and my instincts were proven correct. It was a chilling revelation that highlighted the hidden dangers lurking in the seemingly mundane world of delivery driving. On a chilly December night, a week before Christmas, my family's annual holiday gathering at our Hamptons summer house in New York was underway. Typically, the Hamptons remain serene during this season, with many estates owned by affluent individuals who possessed multiple residences across the country. My dad and I arrived early, taking advantage of the quietude before the rest of the family joined us. My mom and sister were due to arrive the following weekend, still occupied with work. My dad, enjoying his retirement, and I, on winter break from school, sought to relish the tranquility of the Hamptons house. Nestled in a quiet dead-end road, our abode offered individual bedrooms for each family member. As my dad attended to the necessary chores, water, and other preparations after months of vacancy, I unpacked my PS3, ready to spend the first day playing video games. That night, a significant snowstorm blanketed the landscape, prompting our decision to arrive early and avoid navigating the treacherous road conditions post-storm. The next morning, waking to the crisp winter air, my dad inquired about the snowman in the backyard. Perplexed, I glanced out to find a freshly built snowman, complete with stick arms, carved eyes, and a smiling face, seemingly appearing overnight. Assuming it was a harmless prank by neighboring kids, my dad and I dismissed it. However, the following night marked an ominous turn of events. Suddenly awakened by a distinct thump on my window, I cowered under the blankets, fearing an intruder. After minutes of apprehension, curiosity got the better of me. Peeking out, I was startled to find another snowman, this one with an angry frown, positioned right outside my window. Terrified, I called for my dad, who shared my unease upon witnessing the eerie snowman. Determined to address the situation, my dad planned to speak to the neighbors the next morning. However, his efforts yielded no results, as the neighboring house appeared vacant, offering no explanation for the mysterious snowman. Days passed without incident until Christmas Eve night, when our extended family gathered in the living room. A knock on the front door, rather than the doorbell, heightened our anxiety, as we weren't expecting any additional guests. My dad approached the door, questioning the visitor, who pleaded for help, claiming to have no one to spend Christmas with. With no peephole or windows on the door, we couldn't identify the person on the other side. Concerned for our safety, my dad sternly requested the stranger to leave, threatening to call the police. Connecting the dots between the unsettling snowman and the mysterious visitor, we suspected a sinister connection. On Christmas morning, a note taped to our front door revealed the truth. In the note, the writer claimed to have built the snowman for the boy in the house, expressing a desire for a bit of holiday fun and lamenting the lack of companionship. The unsettling note hinted at mental instability or illness, making it clear that the individual responsible was someone none of us wanted to encounter. This incident took place just a few years back. After graduating with my science degree, I eagerly set out to find a job in my field, specifically in the realm of nutrition. However, the job market was tough, especially with the pandemic adding an extra layer of difficulty to the process. Despite the challenges, I remained determined to secure a position that aligned with my education and interests. It was during this time of uncertainty that I stumbled upon a job opening at a company specializing in research and development. Despite coming across some negative reviews about the company's pay and working conditions on job-seeking websites, I decided to apply. To my surprise, I received an offer for the position of a lab technician merely 2 weeks after submitting my application. Excited to kickstart my career, I eagerly accepted the job offer, brushing off the negative reviews as potential exaggerations or isolated incidents. My responsibilities as a lab technician primarily involved conducting various tests and inspections on raw materials, as well as supporting experiments and trials within the laboratory setting. Most days, I found myself engrossed in my work within the confines of the lab, occasionally stepping out to perform calibration chin checks or equipment maintenance as needed. However, it wasn't long before strange occurrences began to unfold, casting a shadow of unease over my otherwise routine workdays. One fateful afternoon, as I awaited the completion of a laboratory test, I succumbed to the exhaustion that had plagued my sleep schedule since the onset of the pandemic. As I drifted into a drowsy state, I heard the faint sound of someone entering the lab. Assuming it to be one of the interns or fellow employees, I paid little attention to the newcomer's presence until I heard the distinct sound of someone tampering with the incubator. Curiosity piqued, I glanced up, only to be met with a sight that defied all logic, a pair of legs resembling a fish's tail, standing upright like a character from an animated film. Shocked and bewildered, I questioned the validity of my senses, wondering if sleep deprivation had induced hallucinations. Yet, the image remained etched in my mind, leaving me with an unsettling sense of disquietude that lingered long after the incident had passed. Despite my best efforts to rationalize the encounter, the feeling of unease persisted, intensifying with each passing day. It wasn't until weeks later, during a routine inspection of the company's stored materials, that my apprehensions were reignited. Upon entering the storage area, a palpable sense of foreboding hung in the air, sending shivers down my spine. As I went about my duties, I was suddenly jolted by the blaring of alarms emanating from a nearby storeroom. Rushing to investigate, I was met with a scene straight out of a nightmare, dry goods ravaged and contaminated, as if by some unseen force. The sight sent a chill down my spine, prompting unsettling questions to swirl in my mind. What could have caused such destruction? And more importantly, was there something lurking within the confines of the laboratory? Something beyond rational comprehension? As the days passed, my fears only escalated, culminating in a series of inexplicable encounters that defied all logical explanation. From mysterious movements in the periphery of my vision to sightings of the enigmatic fish-like appendages. Each incident served as a haunting reminder of the unsettling presence that lurked within the shadows of the lab. Despite the overwhelming urge to confide in my colleagues or superiors, I hesitated, fearing ridicule or dismissal of my claims. Instead, I chose to grapple with my fears in solitude, navigating the eerie corridors of the laboratory with trepidation and uncertainty. And so, as I continue to navigate the murky waters of my job, haunted by the specter of the unknown, I can't help but wonder, what other secrets lie concealed within the labyrinthine depths of the laboratory, waiting to be unearthed? This happened about 2 years ago when I was 18 and in my last year of high school. Like many other girls, I was really into Instagram at the time. I would post pictures a few times a month, and I'd get a good number of likes. Occasionally, I'd get creepy comments or messages from older men, but I usually just deleted them and moved on. In the early fall of 2018, I posted a picture of myself with a friend at school. Shortly after, an older man commented something like, "You're so beautiful," followed by heart emojis. I didn't know who he was, so I clicked on his profile. He had 0 followers and looked like he was at least 50 years old. I immediately deleted the comment. Not long after, I got a direct message from the same man. It said, "Hey, I would love to meet you. Would you be interested?" I didn't even bother replying. I just deleted the message and blocked his account. At that point, I wasn't too worried since I'd gotten similar messages before. But about a week later, I received another message from a different account. It turned out to be the same man, just using a new profile. This time he said, "Why did you block me?" Then a few minutes later, another message came in. "I know where you live. If you don't want to meet me, I can come and see you myself." He followed that up by sending my actual address. At this point, I knew this wasn't just some random creepy guy. I felt scared. I wanted to wait for my dad to get home from work before doing anything, so I could show him what was going on. But by the time he came home and I logged into Instagram again, the account was gone. It had been deleted. For the next few days, I tried to forget about it, but it was hard not to feel nervous, knowing that someone knew my address. Over time, though, I started to worry less, and after about a week, I had almost put the whole thing behind me. Then one morning, I woke up and noticed something strange on my bedroom floor. There was a stack of photos lying near my window, and the window itself was open just a little bit, maybe about an inch. I walked over, picked up the photos, and my heart sank. There were about 10 pictures, all of me, taken from outside my window. I couldn't believe it. Someone had been outside my house, watching me. The photos were all similar, just shots of me in my room. I ran downstairs panicking and showed them to my parents. We called the police and reported everything, but unfortunately, nothing really came of it. It's been 2 years now, and nothing else has happened since. I still don't know if it was some kind of twisted prank or something more dangerous, and I may never know. A couple of years ago, I got my first job. I only worked there for about 5 months. They paid me minimum wage, but I needed the money, and they were the first to get back to me out of all the places I applied. I didn't love the job, but it helped cover the bills for my girlfriend and me at the time. I didn't have a car, so I walked to work every day. The job was only a 5-minute walk from my apartment, so it wasn't too bad. As soon as I got a car, though, I found another job. I didn't just leave because I didn't like it there. Something happened that made me want to quit even more. My schedule was all over the place, and I worked whenever they needed me. Mostly, I did second shift. I usually left my apartment about 10 or 15 minutes before my shift started at 3 p.m., so I was always a bit early. To save time, I took a shortcut to work, a trail that led through a small field behind the gas station where I worked. One day, as I was walking to work, I noticed a guy I'd never seen before sitting in the woods by the trail. He was lying on his side, and the whole area smelled like weed. I think I startled him when I walked past. "Whoa, kid, you scared the heck out of me," he said. "Want a hit? I'm bored and could use someone to talk to." I politely said no and told him I had to get to work, but he kept asking. "Come on, just take a couple hits. It'll make your day better." I don't give in to peer pressure, so I told him firmly, "No, thanks. I really have to go." Then I kept walking. "Wait, I'm sorry," he called after me. "I didn't mean to offend you. I was just trying to be friendly." I told him it was fine, but I couldn't stay and chat. I needed to get to work. I don't have anything against weed, but it's not my thing. Plus, going to work high would have spiked my anxiety. He then asked me for $5, saying he was homeless and hadn't eaten in 3 days. My first instinct was to say no, but I gave him $5 to get him off my back. He thanked me, and I continued walking to work, thinking, that guy was a little weird. I thought about it for a bit while at work, but soon forgot about it as the day went on. By the end of my shift, everything was normal, and I wasn't even thinking about the strange man anymore. At around 11:45 p.m., as I waited for Josh, the third shift guy, to come in and take over, I noticed someone standing outside, staring at me through the window. At first, I thought they were just smoking, but then I realized they hadn't moved. It was a man, but I couldn't see his face clearly. Every time I looked over at him, he was still standing there, staring. He hadn't moved at all. It made me feel uneasy, but I tried to ignore it, picked up a broom, and kept cleaning up my area. Josh was supposed to be there 15 minutes ago, and he'd never been late before. I thought maybe he'd called off. A few minutes later, my manager called to tell me Josh had indeed called off, and I'd have to cover the shift. I was annoyed, but agreed. I also told him about the guy staring at me outside. "He's still there," I said. "He's just staring at me and hasn't moved." My manager told me to tell the guy to leave or he'd call the police. So I walked outside and said, "Hey man, it's time for you to go." The guy just stood there, staring at me for another 10 to 15 seconds, not saying a word. I told him, "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave." Then I went back inside to grab my phone. When I came back, he was gone. I looked around, but there was no trace of him. I didn't see a car, and there was no way he could have driven off. I checked the back of the gas station, and there he was, standing in the middle of the field I took as a shortcut to work every day. He was just a black shadow in the distance, maybe 75 feet away, holding something in his hand. He was staring at me again. We stood there in silence for about 20 seconds, and then he started running towards me. Luckily, I was closer to the gas station than he was, so I booked it inside and locked the door. I looked back, and he was now standing under a streetlight, still staring. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. There was no sign of him, even though I showed them the camera footage and gave them the best description I could. I think it was the same guy I had given $5 to earlier, but I'm not sure. He had long gray hair, but the guy I talked to before had a beanie on, so maybe I just didn't notice. Either way, I stopped taking the shortcut after that, just in case. The police never found him, and I haven't heard anything since. It makes me uncomfortable to think he might still be out there, doing the same thing to other people. I manage a Speedway gas station in Cleveland, Ohio. It's in a tough neighborhood, but the pay is decent, and I can't afford to switch jobs right now, even if I wanted to. One night, around 10 o'clock, I was working the register. My only other co-worker that night was in the back, stocking drinks and handling inventory. It gets pretty busy, and when you're the only one up front, it's hard to keep track of everything. I noticed this sketchy guy walking around the store for about 10 minutes, which was unusual. Most people are in and out quickly, but he kept making eye contact with me. It made me nervous, especially given how dangerous the area is. We're told not to intervene if we catch someone stealing, just report it to a higher up. But I had a bad feeling about this guy as soon as he got in line. When it was his turn, he asked for a pack of Newports and had a tall Bud Light. He reeked of alcohol and was slurring his words. I told him I couldn't sell him the beer, and that's when he lost it. He grabbed the cigarettes and the beer and bolted for the door. But he didn't get far. He tripped almost immediately, and 2 more beers he was trying to steal fell out of his pant leg. An older man who had seen the whole thing tackled him before he could get up, wrestling the items away from him. They struggled for a bit, and just when it seemed like the situation was calming down, the guy pulled a pocket knife and swung at the older man, cutting his arm. Thankfully, another customer stepped in and punched the guy right in the nose. He knocked over some candy, then ran out of the store. I called the police, and we rushed the older man to the hospital. Of course, the thief was long gone before the police even showed up, which took them over 30 minutes. They couldn't do much except take a report and try to figure out who he was. What really gets me is that the guy still comes into the store sometimes, acting all passive-aggressive. He's even apologized to me once, but on another occasion, he threatened to fight me. The stress of working here is wearing me down, not just because of him, but everything else too. I need the money though. I'm a single dad, barely scraping by at the end of the month. I'm 30 years old, haven't graduated high school yet, but I plan on getting my GED soon. After that, I want to go to trade school to become an electrician, so I can make a better living for my daughter and myself. I've had a rough past, but I'm trying to turn my life around. Last summer, I opted to skip taking any classes and landed a job at a gas station close to my college campus. The decision was driven by a bit of disillusionment with school, and I figured I could make some extra cash during my break. Surprisingly, the gas station was the first and last place I applied to, and they hired me on the spot. It seemed a bit odd, but I didn't question it. The catch, however, was that they only wanted me for the night shift, spanning from 11 p.m. to 7 o'clock a.m. I knew it would mess up my already chaotic sleep schedule, but I decided to give it a shot and see how it went. Surprisingly, most of the time it wasn't that bad. The initial hours of the shift were busy, but the late night hours were considerably slow, giving me time to clean, restock shelves, and relax until the morning rush. While occasional suspicious characters wandered in, nothing had spiraled out of control until that one Thursday night. My coworker left around midnight, leaving me alone to man the station. Time flew by, and before I knew it, it was almost 2 a.m. That's when a man walked in, and I got an immediate bad vibe. He had a shaved head adorned with tattoos of strange symbols, and I suspected he was a skinhead. Not helping his case, he parked his dirty, lifted pickup truck in the handicap spot. As if that wasn't enough, he spewed slurs at me, thinking I looked Jewish. It was 1:58 a.m., and he spent a few minutes wandering around the store. In the end, he brought only a case of beer to the counter. Unfortunately, it was 2:01 a.m., and our county had a law putting alcohol purchases between 2 a.m. and 6 o'clock a.m. I explained this to the man, politely and apologetically, but he immediately grew agitated. He ranted about the law, claiming it went against the principles of a free country. Trying to reason with him, I emphasized I was just doing my job. This, however, led to him criticizing me as if I were some spineless pawn for my boss. Feeling the tension rise, I asked him to leave. Instead of complying, he changed his tone, acting friendly and downplaying the situation. He suggested bending the rules for just a few minutes. Perhaps against my better judgment, I caved, sold him the case of beer, and he left with a satisfied smile. However, the relief was short-lived. Rather than driving away, he opened the tailgate of his truck, sat down, cracked open a beer, and started drinking. My gut feeling told me this wasn't over. A few minutes later, another truck pulled up, and 2 more guys with shaved heads and tattoos joined the first man. They stood around, smoking and drinking. Knowing I had to intervene, I mustered the courage to tell them loitering and open drinking were illegal. However, they stared at me through the window, smirking as if challenging me. Before I could act, an SUV pulled in, and 2 more guys joined the group. It was evident they were all part of the same skinhead group. My paranoia kicked in, imagining they were planning something sinister, like burning down the store because the owner's wife was Mexican. The first guy returned, even more intoxicated, and purchased another case of beer. Before I could refuse, he hinted at having friends who wouldn't appreciate me denying him. Feeling threatened, I reluctantly let him have his way. He went back outside, and the skinheads cheered at the fresh case of beer, tossing around the empty cans. Feeling trapped with these individuals, I decided to lock the store door, hoping they wouldn't come back in. I retreated to the office, called the police, and waited anxiously. A cruiser arrived after several minutes, and the officer told them to leave. There was some shouting, but thankfully, they left without causing a major scene. The cop waited for them to disperse before leaving himself. Worried about potential repercussions, I cleaned up the mess left behind. The next day, I reluctantly decided to quit that job. The fear of being stuck behind the register if those guys returned was too much. I still worry that one of them might recognize me around town. I don't know what those people are capable of, but my town is unfortunately full of individuals like them, always causing problems. I was stuck in Birmingham trying to get across the border to Atlanta, which is difficult without a car. I couldn't afford to take the bus either. I walked around downtown in the party district where all the bars and clubs were busy, asking everyone who would give me the time of day if they were headed to Atlanta and could take a passenger. It's a hard process and almost nobody ever wants to do it, but I knew from experience that I could find the right person if I was persistent. I started at noon in hopes that I could find somebody to give me a ride before everyone in the area was bound to stay in the city for the night. It was almost 4 o'clock when I stepped into the country-themed whiskey bar and found 2 men at the bar who looked promising. I approached them and asked my question. At first, they didn't really seem like they even wanted to acknowledge my existence, but after they whispered something to each other, they opened up. They said they were line workers, and they happened to be traveling to Atlanta for some work the next day. They were planning on leaving at 5 o'clock. I said that's great, and since I couldn't afford a drink, I waited outside until they came out. We walked to their van together, and they told me to find a place to sit in the back. There weren't any actual seats, and it was full of tools, but I made do. They weren't very talkative, despite my efforts to get some conversation going. They seemed bitter about something, but wouldn't tell me what it was. Eventually, they just told me to shut up, and I did. I couldn't see very well from the back of the van, but I knew we were heading vaguely in the direction of Atlanta. However, we were only half an hour out of the city when they pulled off the highway, claiming to stop for gas. They didn't pull into any of the stations at the exit, though. I bit my tongue to avoid annoying them, but I was dying to ask where the hell we were going. With every minute that passed, things started to get sketchier and sketchier. We turned off the main road and traveled down a country highway. Then we turned onto a dirt road. Finally, I spoke up and said I knew they weren't going to Atlanta, and that's when they stopped. Without saying a word, they both got out and came around to the back, then opened the doors and yanked me out. All of a sudden, I was getting beat on. They spat on me and called me every slur in the book. Then they ripped off all my clothes and took everything I had, which wasn't much. And then they threw me into a ditch. They packed up everything they took from me and left me in the dust. In a matter of minutes, I was reduced to a naked man without a clue where I was and not a thing to my name. All I could do was follow the cloud of dust until I got back to civilization, where I was immediately arrested for public nudity. It was all right, though. It's not the first time I've been arrested by any means, and even though I hadn't made it to my destination, I had managed to find shelter before it got dark. As for the men that got me like that, I don't have any way of getting them to answer for what they did. It's not like if I had their full names and addresses, it would have made a difference anyway. Men like that grow up thinking they can do whatever they want to a poor black man, and in Alabama they're not wrong. They could have easily killed me, and it's likely my body would have never have been found. After getting released from jail a few weeks later, I had to start all over again. I lived in Birmingham for another 3 months before I managed to get myself fully clothed and fed, and saved up enough cash to get a bus ticket. Because Lord knows I'm never asking for rides in Birmingham ever again. I went hiking in the woods outside of town by myself once. I didn't know the area well, and no one went with me. But I thought it would be okay as long as I stayed on the trail that was supposed to bring me back to where I started. I didn't plan on camping overnight, so I only brought a light pack with me. Not surprisingly, after getting distracted by the scenery, I got lost. I expected to finish the 5-mile loop in about 2 hours, but after 4 hours, I was still in the woods. I didn't pay close enough attention to the trails on the map when I started, so the trail markers didn't help me figure out where I was at all. I tried to look for help on my phone, but I didn't have any service and the GPS was glitching out and didn't give me an exact location. I kept going, trying to stay calm, until 6 hours had passed and I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in miles. Then I knew I was really lost and panic started to set in as darkness was falling. I used my phone too much trying to get a signal or a map, so before I knew it, the battery was almost dead. The last thing it told me was that there was a road a couple miles north of my location. The only things I brought that actually helped were a flashlight and a compass, and I used these to make my way through the brush and bramble in the dark, until I finally came out to the clearing of the highway over 8 hours since I started my hike. I was overcome with relief, but I knew I wasn't out of the woods yet, figuratively speaking. I tried to humor myself by saying my hike could just turn into a hitchhike. It was pitch black except for the stars and the quarter moon, which was mostly covered by the trees. It took 10 minutes before the first car came down the deserted 2-lane highway, but despite my thumb sticking out, they drove right past me. Another 10 minutes later, a truck came past, and they thankfully stopped. It was a beat-up old pickup driven by a crusty countryman, but I was glad just to see another face. He asked me where I was going, and I told him to take me back to the trailhead. He agreed, and I climbed in. One of the first things I noticed was the shotgun sticking out from the cushions of the driver's seat, but I didn't worry about it too much, as I figured most people who lived in the area were always armed. Other than that, my biggest worry was the stench of liquor on his breath, which was very clearly affecting his ability to drive. On the way there, we made small talk and traded names. I gave him a fake name Jack, and he gave me a name Jonah, which I also suspected was fake. He was a local and I was a tourist. He worked in a lumber mill, and I worked from home for an advertising company. He had a family, I was single. He was a jack of all trades, and I was new to hiking and had gotten lost. I trusted that he knew where we were going because I had no idea. Everything just looked the same, just one endless stretch of unlit country road flanked by towering trees. I didn't even question him when we turned down the gravel driveway. It felt like years since I had last been to the trailhead, and I had no idea if the entrance was a paved road, a gravel road, or a dirt road. All of a sudden, Jonah started saying some strange things. "You know," he said, "my family don't have TV or Wi-Fi or any of that stuff. It's kind of hard to find ways of entertaining yourself out here, but sometimes a whole truckload of fun just falls into your lap." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. Jonah paused. In the same moment, we came around a bend of the driveway, and my heart jumped into my throat as I saw something that was definitely not the trailhead. Jonah had taken me to his house, which was nothing more than a single-wide trailer. Inside there was a light on. As the headlights hit the side of the trailer, a woman and an adolescent child came to the window and pulled open the blinds. Their eyes were sunken in, and their expressions were empty and haunting. "That's my family," said Jonah. "They'll be happy to meet you after they greet you, of course." A laugh escaped his lips as if he was proud of some awful and corny joke he just made. "What's going on?" I shouted. "Why did you take me here?" Jonah put his truck in park and then turned to me and smiled. "You're going to entertain my family for a few days, or as long as you last." Every alarm in my body went off as I turned around and tried to escape from the truck, but the door refused to open. "That's the good old child lock right there," Jonah said, laughing. I turned around to yell at him, but instead I found myself staring down the barrel of a shotgun. "You better do as I say, boy," Jonah grumbled quietly. "I just might as well shoot you right now and have my wife throw you in the stew for the next couple of months. Now get out." Jonah stepped out of the driver's seat and ordered me to climb over the console and follow him out. I did as I was told, and then I was commanded to walk toward the house while Jonah held the shotgun at my back a few feet behind me. I walked as slow as Jonah would allow as I thought through all my options. I knew that if I entered that house, I was probably as good as dead, so I took my chances. Without warning, I jumped to the left and broke out into a full sprint towards the woods. Seconds later, Jonah fired the shotgun. The sound was deafening, but in the same instant, fiery hot pinpricks of pain shot through my flesh all over the right side of my body. Behind me, I heard Jonah swearing, "Godum, third shot, you lucky bastard." I kept running despite the pain, knowing I had to get away as far as possible before considering any other part of my situation, whether I bled out and got even more lost. Adrenaline kept me going for several minutes until the pain and exhaustion forced me to stop and take a look at what just happened to me. My luck was incredible. If that psycho wasn't drunk and slow, he would have hit me much sooner and much closer, and probably wouldn't have missed me as much. Also, if he had loaded something else into the shotgun, I probably would have been shredded. I kept going through the woods until, by another stroke of luck, I came out on someone else's property. I knocked on their door and begged them for help. Ironically, they answered the door with a shotgun, but still decided to help me out. After many more hours of pain and bleeding, I finally made it to a hospital. All of my vital organs were spared, thanks in part to my backpack, but a number of those pellets were embedded deep into my flesh and couldn't even be retrieved. I came pretty close to dying that night, and if I had to spend any more time lost in the woods afterwards, I'm sure I would have. Needless to say, I don't go hiking anymore, and I stick to what I've been good at since high school, which is running track. It was a few years back when this happened. I remember driving home one snowy night during winter. The weather was terrible, with heaps of snow coming down. I was on a quiet rural road when I spotted a man standing by the side, waving at me. I scanned around, but there wasn't a car or anything nearby. I wondered why he was out there in such awful weather, especially with no vehicle in sight. Feeling concerned, I slowed down and rolled down my window to check on him. The man approached, visibly shivering, and explained he needed a ride to the gas station. He seemed downcast, wearing no proper coat, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. So I invited him to hop in. As he settled in the car, I noticed he kept staring at me, not just looking but intensely staring. It gave me the creeps, and I had to look away. Even as I drove, I felt his gaze lingering, making me increasingly uncomfortable. With the roads becoming slippery and deserted, I hoped to find a gas station soon. Trying to break the awkward silence, I attempted some small talk, but the man seemed preoccupied with something else, barely responding. Just then, my phone rang, displaying my friend Ben's name. Despite the situation, I answered, hoping for some relief from the tension. After a brief conversation with Ben, I noticed the man in my car seemed disappointed. He muttered something about being dropped off right there. I glanced around and realized we were nowhere near a gas station, just a desolate road surrounded by woods. Feeling uneasy, I asked if he was sure, and he insisted. Relieved yet puzzled, I pulled over, and he stepped out. I watched him as he walked up the road before turning back to look at me. He gestured for me to drive off, so I did, feeling a sense of relief with him out of my car. However, as I glanced back in my rearview mirror, I noticed two other men emerging from the woods, joining the man I dropped off. They seemed to get into a car parked along the road, which I hadn't noticed earlier. I drove home slowly, pondering over what exactly had transpired there. When Aaron asked me out to dinner a few nights ago, I was excited, assuming we'd be going to a nice restaurant, but my hopes were dashed when he pulled into the Burger King parking lot. Still, I didn't mind too much. I loved burgers, and I loved Aaron even more. Any time spent with him was fine by me. However, as soon as we got our food, I noticed something was off. Aaron seemed distant, avoiding eye contact and fumbling with his food. I started to worry that he was going to break up with me. And then he said those dreaded 5 words, "Joe, we need to talk." My heart sank. I braced myself for the worst. On one hand, I was shocked. I thought we were happy together. On the other hand, I understood some of Aaron's issues. He struggled to hold down a job, while I was the one making enough money for both of us. I reassured him that I didn't mind, but maybe he did. Finally, Aaron mustered up the courage to speak. He confessed that he was in trouble. He had been gambling, borrowing money he couldn't repay, and now shady people were after him. My mind raced as I tried to process what he was saying. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It means I'm in danger," he replied, his eyes filled with fear. "And I need your help." I was speechless. Not only had Aaron gotten mixed up in illegal gambling, but he had also used my identity as a cover. I couldn't believe it. We had been together for 3 years, and I had no idea he was capable of such betrayal. Before I could respond, Aaron spotted something outside the window. A black van had parked outside, and 3 large men were approaching the restaurant, each holding a crowbar. My heart raced as I realized they were the people Aaron had been afraid of. "It's okay," Aaron reassured me. "They just want to break a kneecap. Let them do it, and then you can pay them." I was horrified by his words. How could he expect me to go along with this? But as the men entered the restaurant, I knew I had to make a decision. I could either admit who I was and accept the pain, or I could fight back. In that moment, fueled by anger and fear, I chose to fight. I pushed myself out of the booth, grabbed a crowbar, and prepared to defend myself. The men were taken aback by my sudden resistance, but they quickly regrouped and advanced toward me. I knew I couldn't take them on alone, so I came up with a plan. I pretended to surrender, but instead, I pleaded with them to spare Aaron and take me instead. I begged them to leave him alone, emphasizing how much he meant to me. To my relief, the men seemed to buy my act. They turned their attention to Aaron, leaving him beaten and bruised in the booth. As they walked away, one of them warned me not to bring my boyfriend into situations like this again. I watched in horror as they left, knowing that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. Aaron lay slumped in the booth, his eyes filled with pain and regret. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. As I helped Aaron out of the restaurant and into the car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. I had trusted him, and he had put both of our lives in danger. But as we drove away from the Burger King, I knew that our relationship would never be the same, and I wondered if we would ever be able to recover from this ordeal. Embarking on the road to explore the country in my newly converted van was an exciting prospect. Together with my dad, we had spent the entire summer crafting this cozy space, complete with a bed, stove, and a compact fridge. The van held everything essential for my nomadic dream, allowing me to quit my job and embrace the freedom of traveling from town to town, discovering new places and encountering diverse faces, inspired by countless Instagram posts showcasing people living their best lives in self-made vans. I eagerly anticipated hitting the road as soon as the van was ready. After 6 months of living on the road, I had become adept at finding ideal spots to park for the night. Most of the time, I enjoyed the tranquility, ensuring I moved to different spots every night to evade detection and prevent inconveniencing locals. The van, appearing inconspicuous to the naked eye, was a stealthy haven equipped with all the necessities for life on the road. One serene night, I located a perfect spot on a quiet road surrounded by trees. Familiar with the routine, I decided to extend my stay for a couple more nights in this town. However, on the last night around 2 a.m., a knock on the van interrupted my peaceful evening. Initially thinking it might be the police or someone asking me to move, my outlook changed when I peered out of the window to find 2 men, both in their mid-30s, clad in dark attire. The realization struck that this encounter might be more ominous than a casual chat, prompting a moment of hesitation before opening the side window to inquire about their late-night visit. The taller man, his voice low and menacing, conveyed the urgency of their need to talk, emphasizing its importance. Unsure of what to do, my instincts screamed caution. The man revealed they were in trouble and sought my assistance to transport them to a nearby town, promising compensation for my trouble. An uneasy feeling gnawed at me, intensified by the malfunctioning lock on my driver's side door, an issue I had yet to address. Despite my reservations, the men entered the van, urging me to drive swiftly. A faint hope lingered that complying would make them leave me unharmed. During the drive, their constant vigilance, peering out of the windows and frequent glances at their phones, fueled my growing unease. As we progressed, they directed me to pull over onto a deserted road, triggering panic. One of the men disembarked, opening the back doors to sift through my belongings. In that tense moment, I grappled with finding a way out, understanding the importance of maintaining composure. The sudden sound of an approaching car brought relief, anticipating aid from the other driver. I honked the horn, flashing my lights, before hastily grabbing my keys and exiting the van. The two men, caught off guard, fled into the woods. Explaining the ordeal to the other driver, I immediately contacted the police, who scoured the woods without success. The authorities informed me of an ongoing investigation into a series of robberies in the area, suspecting these men's involvement. While shaken by the experience, I felt fortunate it hadn't escalated further. The incident served as a stark reminder to exercise caution on the road and acknowledge that trust in strangers might not always be well placed. Subsequently, I implemented extra precautions when parking for the night, fixing the door lock, securing all windows and doors, and keeping my phone within reach. This unsettling episode taught me a valuable lesson about the significance of remaining vigilant and aware of my surroundings at all times. At 28, I never envisioned myself living in a van, but life has a knack for steering you into unforeseen journeys. After emerging from a lengthy relationship and losing my job, I found myself in a tough spot. Couch surfing with friends provided a temporary solution, but I knew I needed a more lasting fix. That's when the idea of dwelling in a camper van crossed my path. The inspiration struck me on Facebook, observing a man convert his work van into a weekend camper. It seemed like a cost-effective way to regain some independence without retreating to my parents at this stage in life. After scouring online classifieds, I stumbled upon the perfect camper van. It came ready-made with a small kitchen, a bed, and even a compact bathroom. Though not my dream home, it offered more than nothing. Despite a few mechanical glitches and its age, I negotiated a discount, sealing the deal. Hitting the road, the initial months unfolded smoothly. I discovered a serene piece of land online, granting me permission to park my van for a nominal fee. Preferring the stability of a fixed location over constant travel, I spent my days in odd jobs and nights exploring the picturesque countryside. However, a turning point arrived when I returned home one day to discover my van's lock busted open. My heart raced as I entered, confirming my worst fears. Everything was in disarray: clothes, food, electronics strewn about, and some items missing. A call to the police yielded little hope, given the lack of leads. Violated and fearful, I reinforced the lock as best I could, but it still felt insecure. That night, I stayed vigilant in my van, unwilling to leave it unattended. Sleep eluded me as I listened for any signs of intrusion. In the early morning hours, a rustling noise jolted me awake. Peering out, I discerned footsteps approaching. Panic set in as I contemplated calling the police or defending myself, but then I noticed a figure outside, moving toward my van. It was too dark to discern features, but I could tell it was a person. Heart racing, I reached for a piece of wood by my bed, ready to defend myself. The figure, mere feet away, stood silent, motionless. Unsure of what to do, I eventually summoned the courage to call out, receiving no response. The figure remained like a statue before turning and walking away. Come morning, footprints in the dirt around my van confirmed the unsettling presence. Realizing I couldn't live in constant fear, I packed up and sought a new, secure parking spot in the nearest town. As I drove, my mind buzzed with the myriad possibilities of that haunting night. In town, I found a safe place to park, feeling a wave of relief as I settled in. Attempting to move on from the break-in and eerie encounter, the fear lingered, prompting me to avoid going out at night. Overwhelmed, I decided to sell the van and seek a room to rent. Responding to an advert for a tiny room in town, I spoke to the listing lady, Rachel, who had a spare room in her house. It turned out to be a transformative decision. Rachel became a close friend and helped me heal from the trauma. Months turned into a year, and I eventually saved enough to rent my own apartment. As I packed to leave Rachel's house, gratitude overwhelmed me for the unexpected journey that led to new friendships and a fresh start. Reflecting back, I realized that life's scariest moments can sometimes pave the way for unforeseen blessings. While the prospect of living in a van or enduring a break-in was never on my radar, it ultimately led to a new beginning. nestled along the Appalachian Range in the serene landscape of lower West Virginia. I have cultivated a love for backpacking and camping over the years, venturing into various trails around the neighboring mountain. My closest companion in these outdoor escapades is a dear friend who resides just a few miles away, joining me on many of these hikes. Our yearly tradition involves planning an extensive trail in the fall, spanning from a few days to an entire week of backpacking and camping. The highlight of 2019 was a trek across the range, culminating at a small lake atop the mountains. However, fate took an unexpected turn as my friend had to cancel due to a work emergency. Undeterred, having already secured a week off from work and meticulously prepared, I decided to embark on the adventure solo. Setting out on a Monday morning, I drove to a nearby trailhead and commenced my route. Unlike the well-trodden recreational trails, these backpacking trails lack defined paths, necessitating the use of maps, compasses, and landmarks for navigation. The journey typically involves reaching a prominent landmark, such as a distinct rock formation, then proceeding towards the next. The initial 2 days of hiking led me toward a ridge in the mountains. As darkness descended on the second day, I established a campsite several hours from reaching the ridge. With the tent pitched and a crackling fire, I prepared a meal before settling in to read. Leaving the fire ablaze, my intention was to extinguish it before retiring for the night. Approximately 20 minutes into my reading, the tranquil night was shattered by the distinct sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. Startled, my initial thought veered towards a black bear, possibly enticed by the aroma of the earlier cooked food. However, there were no further sounds. Venturing out of the tent and shining a flashlight into the tree line revealed nothing. Calling out aggressively to deter potential predators yielded silence. The eerie situation lingered as I struggled to sleep, my senses heightened for any unusual sounds. Morning brought a sense of relief. Having seemingly slept through the night, packing my tent and belongings, I continued until I reached the ridge. The route from there offered a straightforward path to the lake. Racing against time to arrive before sunset, I managed to reach the lake with an hour to spare. The picturesque scenery surrounding the lake justified the strenuous hike. After a leisurely walk around, I set up my camp on the tree line beside the lake. As night fell, a disconcerting ambience enveloped the area. Soft noises emanated from the trees behind me, resembling footsteps. Despite rationalizing that my fears were unfounded, the creepy atmosphere persisted. The darkness hindered visibility beyond a few feet, rendering my attempts to investigate futile. An hour later, I retreated to my tent, where intermittent footsteps continued, barely audible and leaving me in a state of unease. Exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I fell asleep. Awakening after what felt like only an hour, I was startled by the sound of someone hastily retreating from my tent. Reacting swiftly, I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside, catching a glimpse of the mysterious figure's bare back disappearing into the distance. Heart pounding, I observed footprints around my tent, evidence of someone having circled the campsite. Terrified and isolated, I struggled to reignite the campfire, yearning for better visibility. The night wore on, and although I remained vigilant, no further signs of intrusion manifested. Morning light brought some relief, and I hastily snapped a few pictures of the lake before commencing my journey back. Unease persisted as I retraced my steps, gradually realizing that several items were missing from my backpack, small things like food and tools. The unsettling notion lingered that the mysterious presence outside my tent might have surreptitiously entered, pilfering from my bag while I slept. Even now, the mere thought sends shivers down my spine. I've had my fair share of meals at KFC, but none of them were quite as memorable as the last one I had a few weeks ago. You see, growing up, my parents used to take me and my siblings there as a treat. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the experience, a family outing, they called it. But as I got older, my enthusiasm for KFC waned, and by the time I was about to move out of my parents' house, I couldn't care less about their fried chicken. So there I was, sitting in the dining room of KFC with my parents, chewing on regrettable pieces of fried chicken in complete silence. My dad had just excused himself to the restroom. and I was trying to break the ice by asking my mom what they would do after I left home. And then he walked in, a man who looked exactly like Colonel Sanders, the iconic face of KFC, but it couldn't be him. The real Colonel had long been dead. Still, everyone in the building, customers and employees alike, turned their heads to get a look at him. "Well, a mighty fine Friday afternoon to y'all," he said, his voice booming. "I'm Colonel Sanders." At first, I thought it was some kind of corporate PR stunt, complete with an actor playing the mascot in a room full of unwitting customers. But as he continued to speak, he had everyone convinced, at least for the moment. "I care indubitably for the quality of my establishments," he said, "which is why I'll be performing a full top-down inspection of this franchise today for all of you wonderful folks." He instructed the managers to check their computers for a special message, and the employees sprang into action. The rest of us went along with it, hoping it would be over soon. But as the Colonel made his way through the dining room, something about him began to unsettle me. He would approach each table, ask the customers about their food, and then lean in, staring unflinchingly into their eyes. "Tell me, is it finger-licking good?" he would ask, his voice low and menacing. Most people responded with a quick, "Yeah, sure," or "I think we're done here." But the Colonel would linger, staring into their eyes as he slowly licked his own fingers. It was creepy to say the least, and I found myself hoping he wouldn't come to our table, but of course he did. "Well, how nice to see a young man repay his mother with a nice dinner," he said, addressing both me and my mom, but his gaze was fixed on me, and I could feel a chill run down my spine. "You're a fine young man, ain't you, boy?" he said, his eyes boring into mine. I tried to maintain my composure, but I was trembling with fear. Thank you, sir," I managed to stammer out. No, thank you for dining here, son," he said, his voice low and menacing. "How's your fried chicken? Tell me, is it up to your standards?" I glanced around, hoping for a sign from my mom or for my dad to return from the restroom, but everything seemed frozen, and I was left alone with the Colonel, who was now on his knees beside me, reaching for my hand. "Tell me now, boy," he said, his mouth hanging open. "Is it finger-licking good?" I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, my dad burst back into the room. "Hey, weirdo," he shouted, grabbing the Colonel and pulling him away from me. The Colonel stumbled to the floor, and my dad loomed over him, his face red with anger. "You trying to propose to my son, punk? Get out of here before I make you wish I was a cop." The Colonel didn't put up a fight. He simply laughed, got to his feet, and ran out the door. We left the table in a hurry, and I think that'll be the last time I ever set foot in a KFC. Later that weekend, my dad caught a news report about the man who had impersonated the Colonel. Apparently, he had been arrested for harassing customers and biting their fingers off. It was a chilling reminder of just how close I had come to becoming one of his victims. And to this day, the thought of fried chicken makes my stomach turn. As a recent high school graduate, getting a full-time job at KFC felt like a big deal. We were the go-to chicken joint in town, especially since other places like Popeyes weren't as popular back then. Our hours were usually from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., sometimes even midnight on weekend. The job itself felt like second nature to me. Clock in, clean up, fry the chicken, and assist customers at the cashier, rinse and repeat. But there was one particular incident that made my time at KFC unforgettable. It all started when I encountered a homeless man who had dressed up as the Colonel himself. At first, I was skeptical of his appearance. He looked too fancy to be homeless, but according to rumors from other employees, he had been panhandling in the area for weeks. As I approached the front door of KFC on my way to work, the Colonel raised his plastic cup at me and asked for spare change. "Sir, I only make minimum wage," I replied, but he persisted, asking for leftover chicken during my lunch break. The first few weeks on the job were smooth sailing, but things took a turn for the worse when our chicken supply started running low. My boss immediately pointed the finger at me, accusing me of taking chicken home after my shifts. I pleaded my innocence, but he didn't believe me. This accusation happened multiple times, and each time, my boss threatened to fire me if any more chicken went missing. I suggested investigating the day shift employees, but my boss insisted it couldn't be them since he supervised them closely. But the real drama unfolded on what could have been my last shift at KFC. It was late on a Friday night, and I was just about to wrap up when I heard a loud thud coming from the kitchen area. I cautiously made my way to the back and heard the sound of chewing coming from the stockroom. I knew someone had to be in there eating our chicken, so I mustered up the courage to confront them. I swung open the door to find the Colonel himself, his face covered in fried chicken. I couldn't believe my eyes. The man who had been asking for spare change outside was the same person eating our chicken behind closed doors. He admitted to sneaking in through a panel on the roof every night and helping himself to our food. I was terrified, but I managed to call the police and explain the situation. When they arrived, we discovered the panel on the ceiling that the Colonel had been using to access the building. Surveillance footage confirmed his nightly visits. It was a bizarre and unsettling experience, to say the least. The man who had seemed harmless enough turned out to be mentally disturbed, in need of professional help. And as for me, well, let's just say I'll never look at a bucket of fried chicken the same way again. I used to be buddies with this guy named Jake who worked at KFC. We've known each other since school, and we both ended up snagging jobs at the same strip mall. I worked at GameStop, just a stone's throw away from the KFC where Jake clocked in. I could practically see the Colonel's sign out of the window all day long. So by the time my shift ended, I'd often find myself craving some of that finger-licking good chicken. Plus, it was always nice to swing by and chat with Jake at the register. One evening, after wrapping up work, I decided to grab some chicken for dinner and remind Jake to hop on Call of Duty once he finished his shift. But when I walked into the restaurant, Jake was nowhere in sight. Instead, there was this guy behind the counter, someone I'd never seen before. He looked a bit out of place, like it was his first day on the job, but despite his awkward demeanor, his customer service skills were top-notch. "Good evening, sir. How may I take your order?" he greeted me. Have you seen Jake? I wanted to say hi to him," I replied. "Oh, Jake's on break, sir, but I can help you." On break? I thought to myself. It seemed odd that Jake would wait until the end of his shift to take his break. As I discreetly looked around, I noticed the kitchen was empty. No cleaning, no dishwashing, just silence. It was just me and this unfamiliar guy who didn't even have a name tag. "Excuse me, is your manager around?" I asked. "I am the manager, good sir. Yes, it's just me tonight, holding it down for the customers." "Why do you ask? Are you interested in joining the KFC team?" he inquired. Thank you, but no, I'm already employed," I replied, pointing to my GameStop uniform. "Ah, well, I see. It's a shame, though. You would have made great fried chicken. Could I just get a 10-piece bucket and a Coke?" I requested. "Sure thing, Flynn. Cash only, by the way, the card reader's broken," he informed me. I handed him a tenner and reluctantly tipped him some quarters from the change he gave me. Despite feeling a bit uneasy, I waited patiently for my order. When the guy finally returned with my meal, I grabbed it and made a beeline for the exit. All I wanted was to go home, eat my chicken, and unwind with some video games. As I devoured the chicken, I couldn't help but marvel at how delicious it was. "Man, this has got to be the best KFC I've ever had," I thought to myself. But as I reached the bottom of the bucket, I made a startling discovery. A small rectangular object buried beneath the breading. Curious, I fished it out, only for the breading to crumble away, revealing a small piece of white plastic with a pin attached to it. It was a name tag. My heart sank as I read the name printed on it, Jake. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. Jake had been in that bucket all along, wafting into my nose, getting ground between my teeth, and sliding down into my stomach. "No, no, 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 this can't be," I muttered in disbelief, dropping the bucket onto the ground. Frantically, I dialed Jake's number, but there was no answer. Panic set in as I called his mom, only to learn that Jake hadn't come home that night. And then, as if on cue, I heard a chilling voice in my head, echoing the words of the strange guy at KFC. "Tell me, is it finger-licking good?" I was frozen in terror, realizing the horrifying truth of what I had just consumed. A few years back, I found myself working as a driver for a pizza chain in my hometown. At 27, I was making decent money with deliveries, which helped me stay afloat while paying off my student loans. Even after what happened, I still occasionally work as a dasher, but I'm much more cautious about where I deliver now. One evening, I had a double shift, meaning I had 2 deliveries to make back to back. Both were cash orders, and I had about $12 left in my bank, which drivers like me were given to use as change for cash orders, so we wouldn't carry a lot of cash on us at any given time. The first delivery went smoothly. The customer tipped generously, and I was feeling pretty good about the night. But then came the second delivery, which turned out to be the beginning of a nightmare. The delivery was to an apartment complex, one I had been to before. It was still light out, with the sun about to set, but something felt off as I approached the building. The complex was quiet, almost too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I made my way to the door. A young guy greeted me, but there was another man, older and bigger, lingering nearby, smoking a cigarette. As I handed over the order, the young guy seemed nervous, constantly looking around as if he was expecting someone else to show up. That's when things took a terrifying turn. Suddenly, the young guy pulled out a gun and pressed it against my temple. My heart stopped as I felt a chill run down my spine. I was frozen in fear, unable to speak or move as he demanded my money and keys. With trembling hands, I handed over everything I had, praying that they would spare my life. Another guy appeared, grabbing the pizza bag and running off with it, while the first guy searched my company car. Thankfully, I had left my wallet in my personal car, but they took my cell phone, which held precious photos of my son. In a panic, I begged them not to take my phone, lying that it contained pictures of my deceased son. The lie seemed to resonate with one of the guys, who assured me that they wouldn't harm the phone. As they fled the scene, they dropped the gun in front of me, a haunting reminder of the terror I had just endured. Left alone and shaken, I collapsed on the ground, feeling helpless and vulnerable. A kind woman from a nearby apartment came to my aid, offering me shelter and support until the police arrived. She showed me compassion in my darkest hour, for which I will be forever grateful. When the police arrived, they took my statement and began their investigation. Miraculously, the suspects were apprehended less than 20 minutes after the robbery, thanks to a timely tip-off. They were caught with stolen phones and other evidence linking them to the crime. I was asked to identify the suspects, and despite my fear, I cooperated with the police. It was later revealed that they were teenagers, the youngest being only 15 years old. Despite their youth, they were charged and sentenced accordingly for their crimes. The ordeal didn't end there. In the aftermath, I had to deal with the aftermath of the incident, including replacing my slashed tires and filing reports with my employer and the police. My manager was understanding and supportive, allowing me to take time off to recover from the trauma. But the nightmare didn't truly end until I received a letter from the state, informing me that one of the suspects was being released early due to overcrowding. It sent a shiver down my spine, knowing that he would soon be back on the streets. Despite the fear and uncertainty, I refused to let the events of that night define me. I've learned to be more cautious and vigilant, especially when it comes to my safety. And while the scars of that night may never fully heal, I'm grateful for the kindness and support I received from strangers and loved ones alike. It was supposed to be just another routine delivery, one of the last for the night. I was working at this little pizzeria called Leonardo's, and Frank, one of my bosses, was on the night shift with me. Frank usually decided who would take which delivery, and this time it was my turn. We received an order for a couple of regular pizzas, and Frank handed me a slip of paper with the address and the customer's phone number scribbled on it. It was back in 2009, so I didn't have a fancy smartphone with GPS, nope, just a simple flip phone. And those Garmin GPS devices, nope, didn't have one of those either. I relied on good old-fashioned paper maps to find my way around when making deliveries. The address I was given was somewhere along Willows Road, but I couldn't recall the specific house number or the customer's name. All I remembered was the struggle I had trying to find the place. It was in this really rural town, surrounded by nothing but woods and farmland. And to make matters worse, the lack of streetlights didn't help at all. I had to pull over several times to double-check the map, and each time I felt my stress levels rising. There's something about being on a dark, quiet road in the middle of nowhere that can really get to you. Finally, I decided to call the number on the slip of paper Frank gave me. The phone rang several times before someone picked up. I waited for them to say something, but there was only silence. Eventually, I broke the silence and said hello. To my surprise, a deep, soft voice echoed back from the other end. It was the customer. I explained that I was having trouble finding their place, and the customer, in that same slow, monotone voice, gave me directions. He described his driveway as easy to miss, like just a dirt trail. With his guidance, I finally managed to find it. I turned my car onto this narrow dirt path, and after about 30 seconds of careful driving, I spotted a small, one-story house with a faint orange glow emanating from one of the windows. I parked next to an old pickup truck and grabbed the pizzas from the passenger seat. Approaching the front door, I looked for a doorbell, but couldn't find one. So I knocked instead. I could hear muffled music coming from inside the house, and after a moment, footsteps approached the door. It cracked open, revealing only a fraction of someone's face. I nervously asked if they had ordered the pizza, and the man confirmed it was indeed him. There was a strange pause, and then he said he'd go get the cash. As he walked away, the door started to slowly swing open on its own, revealing more of the dimly lit interior. The house looked like it was stuck in a different era, with old-fashioned furniture and a vintage record player emitting music from decades past. But what struck me the most was the smell. It reeked of decay. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but when the man didn't return, I knocked again and called out to him. He responded, asking me to come into the kitchen. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but I hesitantly stepped inside, holding the pizzas tightly. The floor creaked under my weight as I made my way to the kitchen. The house seemed to stretch out in a linear fashion, with a narrow hallway leading to the kitchen on one side and a series of closed doors on the other. As I approached the kitchen, I noticed someone peeking around the corner, just a sliver of their face visible. It sent shivers down my spine. Ignoring the unease creeping over me, I asked again for the payment. There was no response, only a soft, unsettling giggle that seemed to echo through the house. Then the man called out a name, Randall, in a tone that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned on my heels and made a beeline for the front door. But as I glanced down the hallway, I saw the figure of a man standing there, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I practically sprinted back to my car, throwing the pizzas onto the passenger seat and slamming the door shut. As I drove away, my heart raced and my mind raced with questions. What had I just walked into? And what were those people doing in that house? When I returned to the pizzeria, I told Frank everything that had happened. Surprisingly, he wasn't mad at me for leaving the pizzas behind. In fact, everyone at the pizzeria seemed to understand why I had been so shaken up. But even after leaving that creepy house behind, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It lingered with me, haunting my dreams, and leaving me with a sense of dread that I couldn't quite shake. From that day on, I made sure to avoid entering anyone's house or apartment during deliveries. I'm 20 years old now, but when this story unfolded, I was just 19. Living in Newark, Delaware, was usually calm and quiet, except during college seasons when the University of Delaware welcomed throngs of students, turning the town into a lively hub of activity. I worked as a bicycle delivery guy at Jimmy John's, a job I still hold today. This event occurred on a Tuesday or Wednesday night in the spring, either late April or early May. My shift typically ran from 7 p.m. to 2 a.m., catering to the late-night cravings of college students and locals alike. Jimmy John's stayed open until 2 a.m. on weekdays, making us one of the few spots available for food after the bars closed. Needless to say, things could get pretty hectic, with orders pouring in and deliveries popping up left and right. But hey, the upside was the tips, so I gritted my teeth and handled the chaos like a pro. This particular night was supposed to be my last shift for a while, and I was looking forward to getting some well-deserved rest. Just as the clock struck 2 a.m., signaling the end of my shift, another delivery request came in. I groaned inwardly, feeling the fatigue settle in. Nonetheless, duty called, and I knew I had to take it. I was familiar with the street and the general area, so I didn't anticipate any major issues. At Jimmy John's, we used bicycles for deliveries, especially during busy periods when the roads were congested. It allowed us to maneuver through traffic more quickly and efficiently. I pedaled as fast as I could, eager to get this last delivery over with so I could finally head home. In less than 10 minutes, I arrived at the designated address. However, when I knocked on the door, there was no response. I knocked again, louder this time, but still no one answered. Irritation gnawed at me as I realized I might have to return to the store empty-handed if no one came to claim the order. Resigned to my fate, I dialed the number on the receipt, hoping to reach the customer, but my calls went unanswered. Frustration mounting, I was about to call the store when I heard rustling from across the street. I glanced over and froze, a chill running down my spine. There, lurking behind some bushes, was a shadowy figure watching me intently. Panic surged through me as I realized I was being watched. I pretended not to notice and continued knocking on the door, hoping someone would answer soon. But with each passing moment, my anxiety grew. I could feel the stranger's gaze boring into me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. Finally, a disheveled-looking guy stumbled out of the house, grumbling about the late-hour delivery. He explained that his roommate, who had placed the order, was passed out drunk upstairs. Relieved to have someone to take the food, I handed it over and quickly made my exit. However, as I prepared to leave, I heard movement behind me. I turned to see the shadowy figure lunging toward me. Adrenaline surged through me as I realized I was in danger. Without a second thought, I raced to my bike and pedaled away as fast as I could. I opted for a nearby bike trail, despite its lack of lighting, knowing it was my best chance of escape. Every shadow seemed to loom menacingly as I rode, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back, fearing that my pursuer was hot on my heels. Thankfully, I made it back to the store unscathed, but the encounter left me shaken to the core. I didn't report the incident to my boss or the police, as I hadn't gotten a good look at the assailant. Instead, I packed up my things and drove home, grateful to be safe. Since that night, I've been extra cautious when working late shifts, always keeping a weapon close at hand. Newark may not be known for its danger, but this experience taught me that danger can lurk in the most unexpected of places. It's a lesson I won't soon forget.